As troops gathered for the Battle of Buna in New Guinea, a company of soldiers emerged from the jungle in the distance. A column of men dragging down the dirt road, their bodies covered in mud and their faces weary from exhaustion. They looked like ghosts. At the time, no one was aware that these men had just completed one of the most grueling missions of the entire Pacific War. A mission that would remain secret for decades after the war was over. Their story is one of the greatest untold stories of World War II, the Ghost Mountain Boys. This extraordinary story begins in early 1942, at the time when the Japanese were launching a campaign to seize New Guinea. This island was the last piece of free land in Southeast Asia and was crucial for the Japanese' big plan to invade Australia. In this effort, the key target was the capital of Papua New Guinea, Port Moresby, a city that was within striking distance of northern Australia. After their attempt to capture Port Moresby by sea failed, the Japanese decided to attempt an overland invasion via the Kokoda Track. This rough mountain path, spanning across the Owen Stanley Range, led directly to the doorstep of Port Moresby. Although crossing it presented a formidable obstacle to the Japanese forces, they nevertheless managed to reach within only 30 miles of the Papuan capital. The city and the surrounding area were defended by a small contingent of Australian soldiers and a local militia force. Although with limited training and equipment compared to the Japanese troops, the defenders fought bravely. However, it was only a matter of time before their defense would collapse. The Australians were in dire need of American support. By mid-1942, Allied commanders began devising plans to push the Japanese back from Port Moresby and eventually from the entire island. In late August and early September 1942, additional Australian Imperial Force troops were deployed to Papua New Guinea. In October, they were joined by the American forces of the 32nd Infantry Division. By autumn 1942, with substantial reinforcements from both Australia and the United States, the Allies were able to launch a counteroffensive. However, the problem was that the advance of Allied troops via the Kokoda Track would cost them too many casualties. At least that was what American commander of the Southwest Pacific area, General Douglas MacArthur, thought. Therefore, he decided to strike the Japanese by outflanking them, thus catching them off guard. For this to be achieved, he needed to attack from an unexpected direction. After reviewing the maps of the island, MacArthur decided that the best way to approach the enemy unnoticed was via the old mountain path known as the Kappa Kappa Trail. At first glance, MacArthur's decision to use a forgotten path to outflank the enemy seemed like a brilliant move. However, this was only for those who knew nothing about the trail. The Kappa Kappa Trail also traveled across the Owen Stanley Ridge, but further south from the Kokoda Track. It was half its length, 84 miles, but far more rugged. Its highest point was at 8,900 feet, with total ascent and descent around 56,000 feet. The trail started at the village of Kappa Kappa on the island's western coast and winded upward through dense rainforest and into mountain passes so steep and narrow that barely a human could cross them. Before the war, the Kappa Kappa Trail was primarily used by indigenous Papuan tribes who used it for limited trade, communication, and inter-village travel. However, even among local populations, it was considered dangerous. They called Mount Suamala, one of the peaks along the trail, the Ghost Mountain. The eerie nickname was earned because of the dense fog that covered the highest peaks and created a surreal atmosphere. However, the natives also believed the Ghost Mountain Track was a haunted place inhabited by evil spirits that seemed to consume people. Those who attempted to cross these mountains often faced exhaustion, disease, and death. Indeed, the trail covered in thick jungle growth hid many hazards, from muddy slopes and slippery rocks to narrow paths and hidden cliffs. Rivers and streams crossed the path, swollen with rain, making crossings dangerous. It was a place where people could easily get lost or injured. The humidity was a problem of its own. The air was moist and hot, filled with all kinds of insects, including mosquitoes carrying malaria. And it was only in the lowlands. At higher elevations, trackers suffered from extremely low temperatures and exposure to fog and rain. The worst part was that the trail kept going up and down, exposing the trackers to constant and severe changes in temperature and climate. Undoubtedly, crossing the path was a formidable challenge even for natives, let alone for soldiers who would never set foot in the jungle, which was the case with American soldiers. This was why the Australian generals were amazed to hear that the Americans were going to try to cross it. Even worse, they had to cross the exhausting trail while carrying arms and supplies, only to face combat immediately afterward. They believed that the Kokoda Track, no matter how difficult, was still the best route to attack the Japanese. At least it could be used by vehicles. As far as they were concerned, MacArthur's daring maneuver was unnecessary. However, General MacArthur wasn't the type of person who paid much respect to other people's opinions, especially when it came from Aussie generals, of which he had no high opinion. Captain William F. Boyce of the 32nd Infantry Division Intelligence Section had already ventured down the trail, paving the way for troops to follow. He reported to Division HQ that the route was taxing but practicable. For General MacArthur, this meant there was no obstacle to his plan. It was a bad decision that others would pay for dearly. The task of crossing the dangerous trail was assigned to the 2nd Battalion of the 122nd Infantry Regiment from the U.S. 32nd Infantry Division. This unit, part of the Michigan National Guard, was one of the first units to be mobilized in the United States once the war broke out in Europe. In October 1940, the entire 32nd Division, to which the regiment belonged, was federalized and became part of the U.S. Army. This meant that the unit was transformed from a peacetime National Guard unit to an active combat division ready for deployment. The 126th Infantry was relocated to Louisiana, where the men underwent combat training for Europe and participated in the famous 2-month Louisiana maneuvers in the late summer of 1941. Then, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. The regiment was dispatched to the West Coast to board ships bound for the South Pacific. Their port of destination was Adelaide, Australia, where the 126th arrived on May 7, 1942. From there, the regiment was sent to Papua New Guinea as part of the Allied buildup of forces on the island. What's more, the 126th was one of the first American units to arrive at Port Moresby. By that time, soldiers, most of them youngsters between 19 and 21 years of age, had no prior experience in combat. Moreover, they were completely unprepared for what awaited them. Neither in Louisiana nor in Australia had they undergone jungle warfare training. For almost all these Michigan boys, this would be their first time seeing the jungle, and what an experience it was going to be. Traveling 85 miles along a rough mountain path was a task that required a lot of time. Given the difficulty of the terrain, it was clear that the soldiers weren't able to carry all the supplies they needed. For this reason, on October 6th, the advance party of 250 men along with 100 native porters under the command of Captain Alfred Mendendorp moved up the trail with a task to establish locations for supply drop zones. Given that they were expected to cross only 2 miles a day, the party had to move well before the main body of troops. 8 days later, on October 14th, 900 soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 126th Infantry, along with accompanying units and several hundred porters and guides, left the division command post in the village of Kalikadobu. The march had begun. The battalion followed the valley of the Mamani River up to the village of Nepeane and further up the mountain to another village of Aropara. It was the easiest part of the trail, but the soldiers had already begun to feel the burden of the load they carried. Each of them bore up to 80 pounds of provisions, field equipment, ammo, and weapons. The gear included a 10-pound M1 rifle or a 12-pound Thompson submachine gun. Machine gunners carried even more. A .30 caliber machine gun alone weighed 30 pounds. Mortar crews had the heaviest equipment: base plates, mortar tubes, and rounds. As the battalion entered a hilly terrain and the journey grew tougher, soldiers began discarding anything they found necessary to lighten their load. Gas masks, razors, and mess kits were thrown away. They threw away the warm clothes which they found surplus in the hot and humid jungle. Many even cut off parts of their pants to reduce the weight of the load. Small groups of soldiers shared one knife, fork, or spoon. Everything that could be discarded was thrown away. At some point, when men were on the verge of exhaustion, they started to discard their weapons. Mortar crews started dropping their base plates, then some of the rounds, and in the end the tubes. Despite shedding most of their gear, the weight of their packs remained a constant challenge. One thing soldiers never even thought of throwing away was their rations. When they started the march, soldiers carried 6 days' rations, including 1 pound of rice, a handful of green tea, some sugar, and 2 cans of bully beef. They didn't want to overload themselves with more food, as they believed Mendendorp and his crew would set up drop zones for more supplies to be dropped by air. The problem was that landing supplies in such a rugged terrain was far more difficult than they imagined. The food supplies became meager as the battalion moved deeper into the mountains. The worst thing was that even the little food they had was not edible. The bully beef was so unappealing that many could only eat it when mixed with rice. However, cooking the rice was an impossible task with the rain pouring constantly. The soldiers struggled to start fires, often spending hours trying to get wet wood to burn only to give up, exhausted and hungry. In such cases, they would only soak the rice in water and chew it raw. Weak from malnutrition and disease, the battalion stumbled under their burdens, dragging day after day through the unforgiving jungle. Heavy monsoon downpours became their constant companion. Each day, rain began in the afternoon and poured for hours, drenching the soldiers and soaking their clothes and gear. It also turned the trail into thick, deep, impassable mud. Often, soldiers took hours to travel just a single mile. Higher in the mountains, the trails became so narrow that soldiers had to walk in line one by one. Climbs and descents were so steep that soldiers had to crawl on hands and knees to cross them. They often edged along cliff walls, holding only onto vines to keep them from falling. For days, soldiers marched, their bodies completely covered in mud. The only opportunity men had to wash themselves was while crossing streams and rivers. Yet swift and dangerous, these rapids were life-threatening. If a soldier slipped and fell into the water, he would have been left to fend for himself. There were no evacuations or help if someone got hurt. The officers pushed the men forward, knowing that stopping was not an option. They had to reach the camp at the village of Jaur, no matter how bad the conditions. As difficult as it is to imagine, these were the lesser problems soldiers had to deal with. An even greater threat to their lives was the spread of diseases through the ranks. One of them was malaria. Soldiers of the Kappa Kappa Trail suffered from several types of malaria, but the most common were vivax and falciparum, each caused by different species of the Plasmodium parasite. Vivax made the men weak, while falciparum could turn them delirious and, if untreated, sometimes cause death. To fight malaria, soldiers were issued quinine tablets. Yet keeping them dry in the humid jungle conditions and with rain pouring all the time was impossible. Tablets dissolved before the soldiers could use them. Another disease that tormented the soldiers of the 2nd Battalion was dysentery. Clean water was a constant issue during the march. If there was no river or stream nearby, soldiers had to drink from muddy jungle puddles, leading to the spread of dysentery. Those who suffered from dysentery had to relieve themselves frequently, often up to 30 times a day, and what came out was mostly blood. Some soldiers could barely walk, as their energy was drained by the illness. The harsh conditions also led to jungle rot. The men had open sores on their feet and ankles, which became infected in the constant dampness. Their sores made walking painful, and without proper treatment, they grew worse. Many soldiers ignored their sores, but this made them more vulnerable to serious infections. In the end, the diet based on white rice led to thiamine deficiency, causing beriberi. This condition brought symptoms like vomiting, confusion, numbness in the hands and feet, and swelling. Due to the harsh terrain and climate, lack of food, and spread of disease, men grew weaker as the days passed. If it weren't for the native porters, God knows how the march would have ended. Unlike the soldiers, they traveled with little more than tobacco, a machete, and a string bag. The carriers helped move supplies across steep, slippery trails and helped soldiers too weak to carry on. More importantly, they shared their knowledge of the jungle, teaching soldiers how to find dry wood and edible fruits. After days of relentless marching, the battalion finally emerged from the jungle, but only to arrive at the peaks of the Ghost Mountain. There, the trail became even more treacherous. Ghost Mountain was covered in moss that was 6 feet deep. The ground beneath was so soft that the soldiers sank in with every step. To add to the eerie atmosphere, there were no signs of life. No birds, no insects, only silence. There was only a thick fog and a strange twilight that reduced visibility to no more than a few feet. The climate in the highlands was also wet and humid, but the temperatures were far lower. With all their warm clothes discarded, soldiers were freezing to death. They slept little, shivering in the cold, wet nights. When they talked, it was about food, about what they missed from home. They shared memories of warm kitchens, of meals with their families. They didn't talk about fear or death. They kept their thoughts focused on the next step, the next mile, on reaching the next village. To make things worse, there were no native porters to help them. After crossing the 9,100-foot pass beneath Ghost Mountain, the battalion entered the League of Nations, Mandate Trust territory of New Guinea. To avoid being captured as illegal warriors, native porters refused to cross the border and went back. Without their help, the 2nd Battalion reached the village of Jaur on October 25, 1942, where they met Captain Mendendorp and Captain Boyce. From there, the battalion moved downwards towards the towns of Natunga and Bofu. The misery continued as the battalion was severely lacking food. Soldiers were forced to eat whatever they could find along their way. Somehow, they managed to reach Natunga, where they received much-needed rest and resupply. Ultimately, after 42 days of marching through hell, soldiers of the Easy Company of the 2nd Battalion entered the village of Soputa near the front line on November 20th. In the following days, they were joined by the rest of the battalion. However, men were in such bad shape that they were unfit for combat. Their appearance was so spooky that the troops nicknamed them the Ghost Battalion. Nevertheless, the men were glad that their nightmare was finally over. As they arrived at the front line, the soldiers of the 2nd Battalion were greeted by an unpleasant surprise. The rest of the 32nd Division was already there. How they arrived there was a real mystery, as they surely didn't use the same trail. Then they found out the truth. While the battalion marched through the jungle and over the mountains, General MacArthur received intel about vacant airfields on the other side of the Owen Stanley Ridge. He used the opportunity to airlift the entire division by November 2nd. Another shocking fact revealed was that during the same period, the Japanese had withdrawn from the Kokoda Track and retreated into the city of Buna. The intended flanking maneuver had failed, and the 2nd Battalion's effort was in vain. It was an effort that they paid dearly, though. 70% of 900 men who started the march had contracted malaria. Amazingly, only 3 soldiers died during the march. 2 of them were swept by the river, while the third died from exhaustion. The force of the youth and the strength of the will kept the rest alive, yet too exhausted to be of any use. However, not according to General MacArthur. Desperate to put as many troops in the action, he allowed the 2nd Battalion only a day for recovery. It was not nearly enough for men who endured superhuman effort for 42 days. On November 22nd, the entire battalion was sent to the Battle of Buna to fight against a battle-hardened enemy. The nightmare was not over for these poor fellows. They only had a short break from it. On January 28th, after the fighting at Buna was over, while speaking about the results of the campaign, MacArthur declared how the utmost care was taken for the conservation of our forces, with the result that probably no campaign in history against a thoroughly prepared and trained army produced such complete and decisive results with such a low expenditure of life. The High Command not only neglected their suffering and commitment to perform the task at all costs, but had completely forgotten about it. For General MacArthur, it was as if the horror at the Kappa Kappa Trail had never happened, and so it remained. For decades after the war, the tale of the Kappa Kappa Trail March was set aside as an unknown dark chapter of the New Guinea campaign. It was passed down only by those who survived it, soldiers of the 2nd Battalion 126th Infantry, the Ghost Mountain Boys. They were the silent witnesses to a terrible nightmare in the jungles and mountains of New Guinea. No words can truly describe it, as one veteran's memory captures. If I owned New Guinea and I owned hell, I would live in hell and rent out New Guinea.